The lobby of the Crane Grand Hotel on Fifth Avenue had been designed to make people feel small in a way they would mistake for feeling important. The ceilings rose 40 feet above the marble floor, and the light that fell from the chandeliers was warm and golden and deliberate, calculated to flatter the faces of guests who paid $2,000 a night and expected the architecture itself to acknowledge their significance. The front desk was a sweep of polished limestone. The flower arrangements were replaced every morning at 6. Nothing in the building happened by accident. Everything had been planned, reviewed, approved, and maintained according to a standard that Isabella Crane enforced with the particular intensity of someone who understands that luxury is not a product but a belief system, and that belief systems collapse the moment they admit uncertainty. Isabella had inherited the Crane Hotels Group at 34, when her father's health declined faster than his attorneys had anticipated. She had spent the following 8 years transforming a profitable regional chain into an internationally recognized brand. She was 42 now, and she moved through her properties the way a surgeon moves through an operating room, not nervously, but with a quality of attention that registered everything and forgave nothing. She had restructured 3 management teams in 2 years. She had terminated a contract with a catering supplier because the garnish on a single plate at a board dinner had been placed incorrectly. She had a reputation for precision that people in the hospitality industry described as legendary depending on their relationship to the word. On a Tuesday morning in October, she walked into the lobby of the Crane Grand and found Thomas Reed on his hands and knees beside the base of a marble column, a small spiral notebook open on the floor beside him, writing. He was not cleaning. His mop and cart were parked 10 feet away. He was kneeling on the marble left hand, bracing against the column's base right hand, moving a pen across the notebook page with a concentration that was under the circumstances startling. Isabella stopped. She watched him for a moment. Around her, the morning lobby moved in its choreographed way, guests arriving, guests departing the front desk, handling the quiet traffic of a Tuesday. Nobody else seemed to have noticed Thomas. He was the kind of person that expensive hotels train their guests not to see, which is itself a kind of cruelty dressed as elegance. She walked to him. "Excuse me." He looked up. He was in his mid-40s with the kind of face that had earned its lines slowly, and the kind of hands that belonged to someone who had spent 20 years in close contact with the physical world. His maintenance uniform was clean. His name badge read Thomas, and beneath it in smaller letters, Facilities. "Ma'am," he said, "what are you doing?" He looked at the notebook, then at her, then at the column. "Feeling for vibration," he said. "There's a micro-oscillation in this column that starts around 7 in the morning and runs until about 9:15. I've been tracking it for 6 weeks. Isabella looked at the column. It was to every observable sense a column, a vibration. "Yes, ma'am. Faint enough that guests won't notice it. But the frequency matches what I'm seeing in the boiler room pressure data and in elevator shaft 3. He paused as if deciding how much to explain. "They're connected, I think." She looked at the notebook. The page was dense with numbers and small notations in handwriting that was neat and careful. She looked at Thomas. She looked at the mop and cart parked 10 feet away. "You are a member of the facility's cleaning staff," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Whose job description does not include conducting structural analysis." He held her gaze. "No, ma'am. It doesn't." There was a pause of exactly the kind that precedes decisions that cannot be unmade. Isabella had not built what she had built by ignoring the feeling that a situation required resolution. She also had not built it by entertaining disruptions to the standard she had established, and a janitor conducting unauthorized experiments in her flagship lobby in front of guests during peak morning hours was a disruption by any reasonable definition. "Come to the front desk," she said. He closed the notebook. He stood. He followed her. She did not raise her voice. She was not a person who raised her voice. She said what she needed to say, in the tone she always used for things that were final, and what she said was that the Crane Grand required every member of its staff to operate within the boundaries of their defined role, that guests expected to see the lobby maintained rather than studied, and that a facilities employee who spent shift time on personal projects rather than assigned tasks was not a facilities employee the hotel could continue to employ. She said the hotel needed standards. She said a janitor who kept stopping to write in a notebook was wasting company time. Thomas Reed listened to all of it without interruption. When she finished, he reached up and unclipped his name badge. He set it on the reception desk. He picked up the notebook and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he looked up, and there at the edge of the lobby near the revolving doors was his daughter. Nora was 9 years old. She had come to work with him because the school's heating system had failed that morning, and classes had been canceled, and Thomas had no one else to call on short notice. She had been sitting in the staff break room with a book, and at some point she had wandered out to wait for him near the lobby entrance, and she had seen everything from there. She was watching him now with the steady attention of a child who has learned to read adult situations by reading her father's face. His face at that moment was composed in the way it always was, patient and deliberate, showing less than it held. He walked to her. He picked up her backpack from where it sat beside her feet. He held out his hand and she took it, and together they walked through the revolving doors and out onto Fifth Avenue. He did not tell Isabella that the notebook was not full of complaints. He did not tell her that the 6 weeks of data it contained represented patterns that no one else in the building had thought to look for. He did not explain what the vibration in the marble column had to do with the pressure variance in the boiler, or why either of those things had anything to do with elevator shaft 3. He simply walked out holding his daughter's hand, the notebook in his jacket pocket, and the badge he had left on the desk already being picked up by the front desk attendant and placed in a small plastic envelope marked "Returned." Thomas Reed had worked in buildings for 22 years. Not in buildings the way most people worked in buildings, occupying them, passing through them, using them as the neutral backdrop of daily life, but inside them in the way a doctor is inside a patient. He had started as an HVAC apprentice at 23, had worked his way through certifications in electrical systems and plumbing infrastructure, had spent 6 years as a facilities supervisor for a mid-sized commercial property group before the company was acquired, and his position eliminated. What followed was the particular economic gravity that middle-aged skilled workers encounter when their expertise doesn't fit the category boxes that hiring systems are designed to recognize. He had taken the maintenance position at the Crane Grand 2 years earlier because it was available and the pay was steady. His wife Ellen had died of an aggressive cancer 3 years before that, and the debt from her treatment combined with the sudden absence of her income had narrowed his options to the ones that paid reliably and without delay. He was not bitter about this. He was, if anything, a man of unusual equanimity. The kind of equanimity that comes not from an easy life, but from a long practice of choosing how to meet the life you have. He had brought the notebook to the Crane Grand because he noticed things. This was not a decision he made. It was simply how he experienced buildings. A variation in air pressure in a corridor. The particular sound a pump makes when the bearing is beginning to wear. The way a marble column transmits vibration from a source 3 floors below. He had always noticed these things, and for most of his career he had been in positions where noticing them was his job and acting on them was his authority. At the Crane Grand he had no authority. He was facilities cleaning staff. His job was to maintain the visible surfaces of the hotel floors, corridors, restrooms, public spaces to the standard the hotel required. He understood this. He did not resent it, but he could not stop noticing. The notebook had begun as a private discipline. He wrote down what he observed, because writing organized what he noticed into something he could examine. In 6 weeks, what he had was not a collection of random observations. It was a sequence. The sequence began in the boiler room. The Crane Grand's primary heating system was a high-pressure steam boiler installed during the building's last major renovation 14 years earlier. By modern standards, it was approaching the outer edge of its operational lifespan, but it was large and expensive to replace, and the hotel's facilities management budget had not prioritized it. Thomas had noticed in his first weeks at the hotel that the pressure gauge in the boiler room fluctuated more than it should during peak morning hours. He had mentioned this to the chief facilities manager, a man named Gerald Pratt, in a brief conversation in November. Pratt had listened with the focused expression of someone who wants to appear to have processed what they are hearing, and then nothing had happened. Thomas had started writing it down. By February, the boiler pressure data in the notebook connected to something else, a hydraulic irregularity in the elevator system. Elevators in high-rise buildings are hydraulic or traction, and the Crane Grand's 3 main guest elevators were traction cable-driven with counterweight systems that depended on consistent mechanical calibration. Elevator shaft 3 had, since Thomas had begun working in the building, produced a subtle but distinct vibration pattern during morning operation. The maintenance log showed no reported issues with shaft 3. Thomas had checked the log in the service room, which was accessible to facilities staff because it was one of the things he had started doing. By March, the boiler data and the elevator data had a third companion, the building's water pressure system. The Crane Grand ran a high-pressure supply to its upper floors through a set of booster pumps on the 4th floor mechanical level. Thomas had noticed, because he cleaned the 4th floor mechanical corridor twice a week, that one of the booster pumps had begun making a sound that was slightly different from the others. Not louder, not obviously alarming, just different. in the way that the sound a human heart makes is different when something inside it is beginning to change. He had written that down too. The column in the lobby was the final piece. Vibration travels through structures in ways that reveal their internal conditions. The micro-oscillation Thomas had been tracking in the marble column at the base of the lobby's northeast pillar corresponded in its timing and frequency with the morning activation of the fourth-floor booster pump and the simultaneous pressure draw on the elevator system. 3 systems connected through the building's infrastructure in a chain that, under normal operating conditions, would be unremarkable. But when any one link in the chain was operating outside its tolerances, the others bore the load, and the load they were bearing was, according to Thomas's 6 weeks of data, increasing. He had tried to tell this to Gerald Pratt 3 times. In November, briefly. In January, with a written summary, he had left in the facilities office. In March, when the pump sound had changed enough that he felt it warranted a direct conversation, each time Pratt had received the information with the same focused, seeming attention and done nothing. Thomas had not known why. He had simply kept writing. He knew why now, sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment he and Nora shared in Woodside, Queens, while she did her homework across from him, and occasionally asked him questions about fractions that he answered with the patient specificity he applied to most things. The notebook was on the table beside him. He had not opened it. He had not decided yet what to do with what was in it. Nora looked up at him at some point and said, "Are you okay, Dad?" "I'm thinking," he said, "about the hotel. About a few things." She studied him with the same steady attention she had used in the lobby, then returned to her worksheet. "The fractions aren't going to solve themselves," she said, which was something he said to her, often applied now in the other direction. He almost smiled. "No," he said, "they're not." He opened the notebook and looked at the last page of data. The oscillation readings from that morning were the highest he had recorded. He closed the notebook, put it on the kitchen counter, and started thinking about what came next. The reason Gerald Pratt had ignored Thomas Reed's reports had nothing to do with incompetence, and everything to do with timing. 14 months earlier, the Crane Hotels Group had engaged a luxury real estate valuation firm to assess the Grand's property value as part of a potential refinancing arrangement. The valuation was significant. It would determine the terms of a substantial loan the company needed to fund its planned expansion into 3 European markets. The valuation had been completed and the financing secured. The process had been smooth. And part of what had made it smooth was that the building's deferred maintenance profile had been presented in the documentation provided to the valuators as minimal. Gerald Pratt had not exactly lied. He had, with the particular skill of a man who has learned to manage upward, described the building systems in terms of their current operational status rather than their projected maintenance requirements. The boiler was operating. The elevators were passing their quarterly safety checks. The pump on the 4th-floor mechanical level was within its service window technically. None of these statements were false. They were simply organized to produce a picture that was more favorable than the one Thomas Reed's notebook contained. Pratt had known since November that Thomas's observations were correct. He had recognized the pressure variance immediately when Thomas first described it, because he had seen the same pattern in the building's service history and had chosen to defer the investigation until after the valuation was complete. After the valuation, the financing had closed, and the pressure to maintain the favorable picture had not disappeared, it had shifted. Acknowledging now that the systems required significant maintenance would raise questions about what had been represented to the valuators. Those questions had answers that Pratt did not want to be available. So he had done nothing. And Thomas had kept writing. The royal delegation that arrived at the Crane Grand on a Thursday in late October was, by the standards of the hotel's history, its most significant single event. A senior member of a Scandinavian royal family, traveling with an accompanying staff of 31, had selected the Crane Grand for a 4-night stay during a private visit to New York. The booking had been arranged through diplomatic channels 8 months earlier. The logistics had been the subject of weekly planning meetings for 12 weeks. Isabella Crane had reviewed the preparation personally on 3 separate occasions, the final one the previous morning. By 8:45 on the first morning of the delegation's stay elevator shaft, 3 had stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The car was suspended between the 14th and 15th floors, with 4 members of the delegation's security detail inside. The emergency communication system was functioning. The occupants were not in danger, but they were not moving. And the building's elevator service contractor had been called and was 40 minutes away, and the 14th and 15th floors were the floors on which the delegation's principal suites were located. By 9 o'clock, the hot water in the delegation's suites had reduced to a temperature that was technically warm, but fell below any reasonable definition of the word hot. By 9:20, the fourth-floor mechanical room had triggered an automated pressure alarm on the building management system. Isabella was in the building when the first call came. She was in the general manager's office reviewing the morning's briefing. She received the calls in the order they arrived: elevator, hot water, pressure alarm, and by the third call she was moving. She found Gerald Pratt in the mechanical room with two of his staff looking at the pump panel with the expression of a man who is hoping the problem will reveal itself without his having to admit he already knows what it is. "Tell me," she said. He told her what he could. The booster pump had experienced a pressure failure. The failure had caused a cascade water pressure to the upper floors was compromised, and the resulting hydraulic fluctuation had interacted with the elevator system's mechanical calibration in shaft 3 in a way that had triggered the car's safety brake. "How did this happen?" she said. He used the word sudden. He said he had not anticipated. He said there had been no prior indication. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. She had been in rooms with people who were not telling her the truth often enough to recognize the quality of the silence that surrounds an incomplete answer. She did not press him in the mechanical room. She turned to the building's systems panel and began asking questions of the panel itself, which was more reliable. What the panel showed her in the accumulated data of its sensor logs was that the pressure in the boiler system had been elevated outside its normal range for at least 4 months, that the booster pump's performance metrics had been declining since February, that elevator shaft 3 had registered repeated micro-vibration alerts since the previous November, all of which had been acknowledged in the building management system, and none of which had been escalated. She stood at the panel for 2 minutes without speaking. Then she turned to Pratt and said, "Someone has been watching this building." "Who?" He did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "There was a facilities employee," he said finally. "He was let go this week. He had been making informal reports about building systems." Isabella said nothing for a moment. "Then get me his personnel file. Now." The call came to Thomas's cell phone at 11:47 on Thursday morning. He was in the waiting area of a staffing agency in Long Island City, holding a numbered ticket and listening to the sound of a name being called from a desk across the room. Nora was in school. He had the day organized around what needed to happen next. He did not recognize the number. He answered anyway. The voice on the other end identified itself as belonging to Isabella Crane. She said his name, his full name, and then she said, "I need to ask for your help." He held the phone for a moment, without responding. "The hotel is in a systems failure," she said. "We have a royal delegation on the upper floors. The elevator in shaft 3 is stopped. Hot water is compromised. The boiler pressure is critical." "I know," he said. A brief pause. "You predicted this. I documented it," he said. "There's a difference." Another pause longer. "Will you come back?" Thomas looked at the numbered ticket in his hand. 47. The counter was on 32. He thought about the notebook on the kitchen counter at home. He thought about what Nora had said the night before, about fractions not solving themselves. "Under what terms?" he said. She did not hesitate. "Whatever terms you name." He named them. He said he would come as a technical consultant, not as a cleaning employee. He said he would be paid for his time at a professional rate. He said the terms would be in writing before he crossed the threshold. He said one more thing, which he said last and which he said quietly: "I need to understand that you know what happened here. Not just the system failure, what happened before it." There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that he thought the call might have dropped. "I understand," she said. He stood up, put the numbered ticket in the pocket of his jacket, and left the waiting area. He had asked Nora's after-school neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, to collect her if he wasn't back by 3. He was in a car on his way to the hotel by 12:20, the notebook in his jacket, his phone showing the building management system data that Isabella had sent him as a screenshot, because she could not wait for him to arrive before knowing what she was looking at. He studied the screenshots while the car moved through midtown traffic. The cascade was exactly what he had modeled in his head over 6 weeks of data collection. The boiler operating above pressure had been compensating for a valve that was not sealing correctly. The additional pressure load had been drawn through the booster pump, which was already operating at reduced efficiency. When the pump's capacity was finally exceeded, the pressure wave it generated had traveled backward through the hydraulic line and interacted with the fluid brake system in elevator shaft 3. At the precise moment, the car was in motion between 2 floors. The system had not failed suddenly. It had been failing for months, communicating its distress in the language of physical systems, pressure variations, vibration patterns, sound frequencies to anyone who was listening. Thomas had been listening. He was met at the service entrance by a building manager named Elena Voss, who had the look of someone who has been managing a crisis for 3 hours and is very grateful to see anyone arrive with a plan. She walked him to the mechanical room. Isabella was there, and Gerald Pratt was there, and 2 contractors from the elevator company were there, and the room had the compressed energy of people who are out of their depth and know it. Thomas opened the notebook on the mechanical room's service table and began to work. He did not speak to Pratt. He did not need to. He spoke to the building, its gauges, its pressure readings, its sensor logs the way he always spoke to buildings, which was by listening first and speaking only when he had something accurate to say. The first thing he did was isolate the boiler from the secondary pressure circuit by routing through a bypass valve that had been installed as a contingency measure during the original build and had never, as far as he could tell from service records, been used. The effect was to reduce the pressure wave that was sustaining the elevator brake lock. Within 11 minutes of the bypass being opened, elevator shaft 3's safety system received the signal it needed, and the car began to move. By 1:15, the elevator was operational. The hot water required a different approach. The booster pump's failure had dropped pressure to the upper floors below the threshold needed to activate the heat exchange cycle. Thomas walked through the solution with Elena Voss, while a contractor physically opened the pump casing and confirmed what Thomas had written in the notebook in March. The bearing was worn to a degree that had been significantly reducing the pump's output for at least 8 weeks. He had a written estimate of the failure point in the notebook. It matched the actual date of failure within 4 days. A temporary pump was available in the building's secondary storage, a unit that had been installed 2 years earlier as backup and never connected to the main system. Thomas confirmed its compatibility, directed its connection to the circuit, and by 2:40, the upper floors had restored hot water pressure. The boiler remained the largest problem. Bypassing it had resolved the immediate crisis, but not the underlying condition. Thomas sat with the boiler specifications and his 6 weeks of data and worked through what the correct sequence of repairs needed to be, which components in what order, at what priority level, with what temporary compensating measures in place while the primary work was done. He wrote it out. Not in the notebook on the hotel's own maintenance forms in the spaces designated for technical assessment in the language of a building engineer, which was the language he had always actually spoken. He handed the completed forms to Elena Voss at 3:55. He looked at Isabella across the room. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded, a single deliberate movement that acknowledged more than it said. He went to pick up Nora at 4:20. She was on Mrs. Calloway's front step, working on the fractions worksheet she had apparently not finished the night before. She looked up when she saw him coming. "Did you fix it?" she said. "Most of it," he said. "The rest will take a few days." She nodded, gathered her things. "Good," she said, which was the word she used when she had decided something was settled, and he understood that it applied to more than the hotel. Gerald Pratt was placed on administrative leave the following morning. The investigation that followed moved with the quiet efficiency of a process that has a clear starting point and a clear ending point, and needs only to travel between them. Isabella engaged an independent firm to review the building's maintenance records against the valuation documentation submitted 14 months earlier. The review took 6 weeks. Its findings were not complicated. The gap between what the building systems had required and what had been represented to the valuators was documented, and the trail of maintenance reports that had been received and not escalated was documented, and the decision points at which Gerald Pratt had chosen silence over disclosure were documented with the methodical completeness of a process that has no interest in anything except what is true. The legal and financial consequences took longer to unfold. They were not Thomas's concern. He was not a litigator. He was not an investigator. He was a man who had noticed things and written them down, and the record he had kept had turned out to be more durable than the silence it stood against. Isabella called him into her office on the Monday after the crisis. The office was on the 22nd floor, and had the sightlines of a place whose occupant wanted to be able to see what was coming. She sat across from him at a table rather than behind her desk, which he noted as a deliberate choice. She said, "I owe you an apology." He waited. "I fired you because you were doing something I didn't understand, in a context where I thought I understood everything." She said it with the precision of someone who has thought about it carefully. "That was a failure of judgment on my part. I want to say that clearly." He looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "I also want to offer you something." She placed a document on the table. Senior Technical Advisor Building Systems. Full benefits. Salary in keeping with the role's actual requirements. She paused. "I spoke with someone at the Building Engineers Licensing Board about your certification history. With your existing credentials, and the right coursework, you'd be fully licensed within 18 months. The company would fund that. Thomas looked at the document without picking it up. I want to understand what the job actually is, he said. Not what the title says. She told him. It was a real description, the kind that comes from someone who has thought about what the work genuinely requires, rather than what the organizational chart needs a role to look like. She talked about the scope of the technical oversight responsibility, the authority structure, the reporting lines, the expectations. He asked 3 specific questions. She answered them specifically. The answers were not perfect, but they were honest, and he had enough experience with the difference to recognize it. He picked up the document. I'll need to review this, he said. I'll give you my answer by Wednesday. She nodded. Take the time you need. He stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. The boiler will need full replacement within the next 18 months, he said. You'll want to start the procurement process. Lead time on the right unit for this building is approximately 8 months. She looked at him. You've already scoped it. I scoped it in February, he said. The notebook has the specifications. He left. The Tuesday after he accepted the position, Thomas walked Nora to school, the way he always did, through the 4 blocks of Woodside that connected their building to the school's front gate, a walk that took 11 minutes and had a reliable sequence of things Nora would point out or comment on, depending on the morning. A bodega that had recently changed its window display, a pigeon that consistently occupied the same fire escape on 51st Street and which Nora had named Gerald, which Thomas thought was a coincidence that was probably not a coincidence. At the school gate, Nora turned and looked up at him with the evaluating attention she had been applying to things since she was approximately 4 years old. Are you going to like the new job, she said. He thought about it. I think so, he said. It's complicated. You like complicated. I like problems that have solutions, he said. Complicated is fine if there's a solution at the end. She considered this, nodded, and turned toward the school's entrance. Then she stopped and looked back. Dad, you always find the solution. He watched her go in through the gate. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hands in his pockets looking at the door she had disappeared through. Then he turned and walked in the direction of the subway because it was 8:22 and his first full day in the new role began at 9, and he had a meeting about boiler procurement specifications that he had, if he was being accurate, been preparing for since February. The Crane Grand's building systems review, which Thomas completed in his first 3 months in the new role, ran to 87 pages. It was not a dramatic document. It did not read like a story. It was a technical assessment organized by system, with findings ranked by urgency, recommended remediation timelines, cost estimates, supported by vendor quotes, and a maintenance schedule designed to prevent the conditions that had allowed the crisis to develop. It also contained an appendix. The appendix was 12 pages long, and it was a direct reproduction of the relevant sections of the notebook, the 6 weeks of pressure readings, vibration measurements, pump performance data, and annotated observations that Thomas had compiled before his dismissal. It was included not because the data was necessary for the recommendations, which stood on their own merits, but because Thomas had decided that the record of what had been noticed should become part of the building's permanent history. Isabella read the appendix before she read anything else. She read it in the same way Thomas had written it, carefully, and all the way through without skipping the parts that were uncomfortable. The pressure readings from November after the first conversation with Pratt, the elevator vibration data from January, the pump performance notes from March, the column oscillation measurements from October, ending 3 days before his termination. When she finished, she closed the document and sat for a moment with the particular quality of stillness that comes from understanding something you cannot ununderstand. The hotel's physical systems could be repaired. The boiler would be replaced. The pump was already functioning. The elevator in Shaft 3 had passed 3 consecutive safety inspections since the crisis and would continue to be monitored. These were solvable problems, and they were being solved. What the appendix documented was something adjacent to the technical failures but not identical to them. It documented the failure of a system to hear what it was being told. It documented what happens when the person doing the noticing is not the person with the authority to act on what they notice. It documented the specific cost of a hierarchy that confused position with perception. Isabella had spent 8 years building a company on the premise that standards were maintained through discipline and attention and the willingness to correct what was wrong. She had been correct about this as far as it went. What she had not fully understood, and what she understood now in a way that would take her longer to fully act on than she would have liked, was that attention flows toward the things an organization decides to look at, and what an organization decides to look at is shaped by who has the authority to decide. She called Thomas's office extension. He picked up on the second ring. "The appendix," she said. "Yes," he said. "It should have been part of the building's record from the beginning. It should have been acted on from the beginning," he said. "The record is the second best outcome." A pause. "Fair point," she said. She thought about what she wanted to say next and decided to say it directly. "I want to change how maintenance reporting works in this building. I want the people who are closest to the systems to have a direct line to escalation, not through a manager who has reasons to filter what gets heard." "That's the right change," he said. "It will be resisted." "I know." She paused again. "Will you help me design it?" He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking which looked similar but was different in the way it felt from the inside. "Yes," he said. "But I want to be clear about something. Go ahead." "The people who should have the most access to that reporting line are the ones who are currently least visible in the building. The cleaning staff, the overnight maintenance crew, the kitchen support team." He said it plainly, without heat. "The people who are in contact with the building systems every day and who nobody currently asks." She understood what he was saying, and she understood that it was a harder change than the structural one because it required revising not just a process, but an assumption. It required deciding that expertise was not a credential but a capacity, and that capacity could be found in unexpected places if you were willing to look. "I understand," she said. "I know you do," he said. And he meant it as a straight statement, not a concession. Because one of the things Thomas Reed had learned in 22 years of working inside buildings was that the difference between a person who could hear hard things and a person who could not was the difference between a building that could be maintained and one that could not, and Isabella Crane, he had decided, was the former kind. He had decided this partly on the basis of the conversation in the lobby, on the morning she had fired him. Not because of what she had said had been wrong and he had known it was wrong at the time, but because of the precision with which she had said it. She had been precise about the wrong thing. That was fixable. Imprecision was not. The boiler was replaced the following August. It was a 14-day shutdown of the primary heating circuit coordinated with a period of reduced occupancy that Thomas had identified 6 months in advance as the optimal window. The new unit came from a manufacturer in Ohio, installed by a crew that Thomas had selected after reviewing 3 bids and visiting 2 of the 3 facilities in person, which was not required by the procurement process, and which he had done anyway. On the day the new boiler was commissioned, the building engineer from the manufacturer walked Thomas through the system's operational parameters, and then stood back and watched Thomas interact with the equipment with an attention that was not performative, but genuinely interested, the way one craftsman watches another reading technique and intention. He asked Thomas how long he had been working with building systems. Thomas told him. The engineer nodded. "You think like someone who's been doing this a long time," he said. "But you notice things that most people with that kind of experience have stopped noticing." Thomas considered this. "I had a reason to keep noticing," he said. The engineer seemed to understand this was sufficient explanation and did not ask for more. That evening, Thomas took Nora out for dinner at a diner in Woodside that they had gone to for special occasions since she was 5, a place with red vinyl booths and a menu that had not changed in at least 15 years and milkshakes that were by any objective measure exactly right. They had been going there after good things and after hard things. And over the years, the diner had accumulated a kind of significance that had nothing to do with the food and everything to do with the consistency of showing up in the same place to mark the days that mattered. Nora was 10 now. She was in 5th grade and had recently decided that she was interested in structural engineering, which Thomas received with the careful neutrality of a parent trying not to over-encourage something that had emerged entirely on its own. She had asked him last week, with the research quality directness that she applied to most of her questions, to explain how buildings talk to the people inside them. He had told her through pressure and vibration and sound, and the small patterns that repeat over time until they either stabilize or change. He had told her that buildings communicate constantly, and that most people are too busy or too far away from the physical reality of the structure to hear it. He had told her that listening was not passive. It was a skill, and like most skills, it required practice and the willingness to be wrong sometimes before you were right. She had listened to all of this and said, "Like the notebook." "Like the notebook," he said. At the diner that evening, Nora ordered a chocolate milkshake and a plate of pancakes, which she did every time regardless of whether it was morning, because she had decided at age 7 that pancakes were not time-specific and had not been argued out of this position. Thomas ordered coffee, and the same thing he always ordered, which was whatever the daily special was. a practice he maintained on the theory that specials were made with whatever the kitchen had most recently acquired, and were therefore the most accurate reflection of what the place was actually doing on a given day. Nora looked at him across the table with the expression she used when she had been thinking about something for a while and had decided it was time to say it. "Are you glad you went back?" she said. He understood what she was asking. Not just about the Thursday of the crisis. About the whole arc of it, the morning in the lobby, the walk out with her backpack, the weeks between the phone call, the return, everything that had followed. He thought about it the way he thought about most things that deserved a real answer. "Yes," he said, "but not for the reasons I would have expected." "What reasons?" He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "I thought going back would be about proving something. That the work mattered. That what I noticed was real." He paused. "But it turned out it was about something different." "What?" "That being right about something doesn't actually do anything by itself," he said. "The notebook was right. The building confirmed it. None of that fixed anything until someone with authority decided to listen." He looked at his coffee. Going back was about learning that the listening matters as much as the noticing. Nora thought about this for a moment, in the way she thought about things that she was going to carry with her. "So you needed her," she said. "And she needed you." "That's about right," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and devoted her attention to the pancakes. Outside the diner's window, the street had the particular light of a summer evening in Queens, warm and low, and specific to the hour, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look as though they have been selected. A woman walked past with a stroller. A man locked up a storefront. This front, two kids in basketball gear cut around the corner at the end of the block and disappeared into the neighborhood. Thomas sat in the red vinyl booth with his daughter and his coffee, and the accumulated knowledge of 22 years inside the physical world, and he thought about buildings and about the things they say when they are trying to tell you what is true, and about the particular importance of being forward, in the right place with the right kind of attention when they finally get loud enough to hear. He thought about the notebook which was in his desk drawer at the hotel, filed in the permanent maintenance record where it would stay. He thought about the column in the lobby which no longer vibrated in the mornings, because the pressure chain that had produced the vibration had been repaired from the root. He thought about Nora, who had stood in the lobby of the Crane Grand on a Tuesday morning in October, and watched him set a badge on a desk and walk toward her, and who had taken his hand without asking any questions. He thought about all of this, and he decided that it was enough. Not everything he had wanted, not a simple version of anything, but enough, the real kind of enough, the kind that comes from having been present for the actual shape of things rather than the shape you thought they would take. The milkshake arrived. Nora applied herself to it with complete seriousness. The evening light moved across the window and into the diner, in the slow way that summer evenings have as if they understand there is no reason to hurry. Thomas picked up his coffee. Outside, the city went on doing what it always did, making its sounds, holding its weight, communicating constantly in the language of pressure and vibration and pattern to anyone who was paying attention. He was paying attention. He always had been. That, it turned out, had been enough to start with. The rest had been built from there.